Transitioning to electric transportation is one very important step in our efforts to reduce the greenhouse gas or GHGs emissions that are causing the climate crisis. The world needs to transition to cleaner technologies in every sector as quickly as possible. Do we actually have the technology and the needed materials to make this transition and to make it quickly? Welcome to our 49th episode of Canada Talks Electric Cars, brought to you by Electric Vehicle Society. My name is Tim Burrows, and I'm pleased to host this very important episode. Today's speaker is Raymond Leury. Raymond retired 6 years ago from a career in information technology. In 2017, he took Al Gore's Climate Reality Corp training, which reignited his passions for the environment and climate change in particular. As president of the Electric Vehicle Council of Ottawa, also known as EVCO, he, along with his team, have spearheaded a number of initiatives, including a successful campaign to have the City of Ottawa transition to a fully electric bus fleet. Raymond, welcome to Canada Talks.
Thank you very much, Tim. Let me share my screen here. There we go.
Yeah, great to have you on. Appreciate you taking some time and sharing. I had a chance to see a portion of this presentation a while ago, and it was very impressive and quite informative in the way you put things together. So I felt that the folks that follow our webinar would also get a lot out of it. And so appreciate you coming on and doing it.
Great. So let's get this on the road then.
You got it.
Thanks a lot for having me, Tim. This topic is important to me for a number of reasons, right? So the title today is Can e-mobility can e-mobility happen fast enough? I put in brackets there, and the energy transition. Those are very much related to one another. And why they're related, Tim alluded to it, this issue here of climate change, which is, if you look at the red line for 2023, this graph shows the average temperature over the last about 80 years, and you can see that over the years the temperature's gotten hotter and hotter, and this last week has been actually extremely hot, and that's an indication that things are getting worse. So the idea is to try to do what we can to try to slow that down. So the agenda for today, I want to start by talking about disinformation and misinformation, because that's, I think, very important in the context of what we're talking about here. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation circulating out there in the public and in social medias and all that. Then we'll talk about, do we have enough materials? We'll focus a lot on EVs, but we'll talk about the green transition with green electricity in particular also. Then we'll talk about technology adoption and how fast technology gets adopted. And that will inform the discussion on how fast I expect, and we expect that EVs will become dominant in the market, right? So how fast the sales will grow, and how fast will it be before ICE vehicles are a thing of the past. Then we'll talk a bit about the current market in that context to see what the predictions are for Canada and for the world as a whole. So let's start with disinformation, misinformation. So if you look at the picture on the left, that's a bus in Hamilton. So Hamilton, Ontario, obviously, is Ontario's first carbon negative bus. So if any of you know anything about carbon and buses and compressed natural gas, you know that that's absolutely disinformation. That's a total lie. That bus, to be carbon negative, would have to be soaking up a whole bunch of carbon, and it's not. It's actually producing lots of greenhouse gases by burning compressed natural gas. Now, compressed natural gas, if you look at the whole life cycle of producing it, distributing it, and all that, there's lots of leakage that happens. So because of that, studies have shown that compressed natural gas buses are just as bad, about as bad as diesel in terms of greenhouse gases. So no matter what Enbridge says, they're not particularly great for our environment. So this transition that we're going through, the EV transition, and also solar and wind and batteries, is really an existential crisis for the fossil fuel industry. So they're reacting to that. Some of you may have read a book called Merchants of Doubt. I actually just read it not too long ago. It was published about 15 years ago. And it talks about how industry has been working behind the scenes to try to for many different topics, whether it's the ozone hole, acid rain, smoking, and a number of other issues. Industry has been working behind the scenes to try to make us believe that things aren't as bad as they are. So they hire the best PR firms in the world for that. They have lots of money. You probably have seen that the fossil fuel industry made over $200 billion of profit last year. That's $200 billion of profit in 1 year. So they have lots of money, and they hire the best PR firms, and actually literally the same folks who told us back in the 50s and 60s that cigarettes did not cause cancer. Okay. One of my favorite sayings is don't ask a barber if you need a haircut. And that says a lot. But in essence, what it says is if someone has an interest in, or commercial interest in particular, in something that you're doing or something that they're recommending or whatever, you should really take their advice with a grain of salt. And this applies to a bunch of things. So you know, the way I see it is you should never assume that you're being told the truth, okay? And this applies to lots of things. So back to the compressed natural gas bus. At one of the Transit Commission meetings here in Ottawa, I was delegating, and one of the delegates before me came from Enbridge, and he was telling us how, you know, these compressed natural gas buses were great, and they're much better for the environment than even battery electric buses, and blah 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 blah. Right? So, why was he doing that? It's because Enbridge wants to keep selling natural gas, so so they're selling their own product, right? Excuse me. And this extends to something that we hear often, that we'll always need fossil fuels. I won't go into details about that today, but that's arguably false, that we will not always need fossil fuels. We used to live without fossil fuels. There's no reason why we can't do that again. And the volume of disinformation has been increasing substantially in the last couple of years, so much so that the guys in the UK that run the fully charged started an organization called Stop Burning Stuff. And the idea there is to try to fight the disinformation, particularly in the mainstream media, because the mainstream media is often, yeah, I'm sure you've seen stories in the CBC and all that that were a bit surreal. So the idea is to educate people in mainstream media to get them to spread the truth and not the misinformation about EVs. So here, I'm going to go a bit more into disinformation and how it works. So it always starts with a grain of truth. There's always some grain of truth in a narrative that they're explaining, right? So, but what they do is they distort and exaggerate the impact with regards to EVs. So, you know, they make an issue, a front-end issue, and they explain that this is a problem with EVs, ignoring everything else, right? So a good example of that is cobalt and child labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. So Amnesty International wrote a report a couple of years back saying that they found child labor in some cobalt mines in the DRC. So it's very likely that there is some cobalt that's mined by children. That's just a fact. So that's the small grain of truth that they use to distort. So EV batteries use cobalt, right? 40% of the world production of cobalt in 2022 went into batteries for EVs and static storage. So it's a big proportion. And no reasonable person likes child labor, right? So in other words, if you don't like child labor, you shouldn't be buying an EV because cobalt means child labor, right? Now, you only hear of cobalt in the context of EVs. You don't hear about it in other contexts. So if 40% is going to EV batteries, 60% is going elsewhere, right? And meanwhile, we ignore things like sweatshops that make some of our clothing and electronics and other things, right? Not that those sweatshops are good, but it's the context, right? So, and if you look at the context and what they don't tell you about cobalt in particular, First thing is that smartphones, laptops, and many other portable devices have cobalt-based batteries. About 30% of world cobalt production goes into portable devices. Those are likely to continue using cobalt because cobalt-based batteries give us the highest energy density. So it's hard for us to substitute something else that would not have cobalt. And lo and behold, the oil industry uses cobalt. You never hear about that, right? So they use cobalt to remove sulfur from crude oil. The other thing that most of you know, I assume, is that LFP, so lithium iron phosphate batteries, they have no cobalt. And at this time, somewhere around 50% of EV market is actually cars with LFP batteries, and that is growing. I saw a number a couple of days ago that said that in China, 75% of their new vehicles, their new EVs, were using LFP batteries. So 75% of those vehicles don't have cobalt, right? So if you look at the logical conclusion, if child labor really is a concern of yours, you should be buying any portable electronics, your iPhone, your Android phone, your laptop, whatever, you should be buying that. You shouldn't be buying gas because the oil industry uses gas to refine petroleum. And you should buy an EV with LFP batteries. So really, if you look at the logic, when you look at the whole context, EVs are a better choice than gas cars, but that's not what the narrative is, right? So the EV portion of this narrative is distorted, and everything else is ignored. So really, there's no reason to avoid buying an EV because of cobalt. Okay. Now to there's another narrative that we hear often is that we don't have enough materials or minerals to do the green transition. So that includes obviously EVs, but also wind and solar and batteries and other stuff we need to get off of fossil fuels. Well, if you look at fossil fuels, and it's a bit hard to tell here, but there's a building you see there, it's a Burj Khalifa, and that's the tallest building in the world. And if you look at the picture there on the left, it's showing you how much coal, liquid natural gas, and crude oil we are actually burning every single year in comparison to the size of the Burj Khalifa. So you can see that the fossil fuel industry burns and mines and burns a lot of material on a yearly basis, right? 21 billion tons of fossil fuels are consumed every single year. Okay, that's a lot. They're non-renewable, and the energy that we get out of it is very inefficient. And we'll talk about efficiency in the next slide. But you probably know that internal combustion engines get only maybe 20% efficiency, and the rest is lost as heat. So if we look at that from a global perspective for the US, these are US numbers here. There's something called a primary energy fallacy. There's a lot of people out there, like Václav Smil in particular, that are saying that for us to do the green transition, we need to replace all of the energy that's being used right now. So in the context of this particular diagram, if you look at the right-hand side, you see that there's about 2/3 of the energy is rejected energy. So that's energy loss as heat, mostly from internal combustion and other processes. And what the useful energy we get, so the energy services, represents about 1/3 of the total energy that's actually used. Okay, so fossil fuels are very, very inefficient. Now, if you look at on the left-hand side, you see all the sources of energy for the U.S. In the middle, you see the different uses, categories of uses, so residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation. Now, transportation, again, like I said earlier, 20% efficiency or so, which means that a lot of the energy going into transportation goes into rejected energy. Now, if we take that 20% and we compare it to an EV will get somewhere around 85%, for argument's sake, let's say 85%, which is 4 times as much efficiency as a nice vehicle. So the energy being used is used much more effectively. Now, there's other cases like heat pumps. So if you're heating your house with natural gas, you can't get past 100% efficiency. So you get somewhere upwards of 90% efficiency, but you could never get past 100%. If you're using a heat pump, you actually could get to 300 or 400% efficiency. Okay, so instead of rejecting energy, you're more or less pumping energy, right? So the bottom line is that what we need to replace to go green is the energy services here. And if you count all of the clean energy sources on the left-hand side, you'll see that about half of those are already provided by clean sources. So at the extreme, you may need twice the amount of energy that electricity that we have right now. But we're not talking about 10 times the amount that we have right now, like some people will lead you to believe, right? So the problem is not anywhere as big as people are trying to make it out to be. Now, so we talked about fossil fuels. Let's talk about metals. So iron ore, 3 billion tons. That's the thing we mine the most of when it comes to metals. And that's about 1/7 of fossil fuels. Okay, much smaller in terms of volume. And if you look at the other categories there, industrial metals, you're talking about 207 million. So that's less than 10% of the metals are the other metals. And you see there, some of the metals that are important for us in the EV world and clean transition world are copper, aluminum, nickel, and a few others. And if you look at the quantities are very small compared to fossil fuels or iron, right? And if you look on the right-hand side with the tech and precious metals, we're talking about just above 1 million tons per year of materials that are being produced. So that includes things like some cobalt, lithium, and some of the other things, rare earth elements, which are important in the clean transition. So the point is here that the narrative is in part that going green will require mining so much more stuff that it's worse than the status quo, right? So if you look at the numbers, that's patently false. Here, this is a chart which I won't get into too much detail, but essentially, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, they say that the green transition will take about 28 to 40 million tons of minerals or materials by 2040. Okay, for reasons which I won't get into, this is a reasonable estimate, in my view, of how much will be required. Well, if you compare that to the fossil fuel industry, so 28 million to 40 million tons versus, and that's cumulative. It's not every year. Versus 21 billion tons of fossil fuels per year. That's like 500 times more fossil fuels than what we need for the green transition. Okay, so the numbers are so different that that the fossil fuel production overtakes everything else. So if you look at the chart on the right, just a few examples. The first one at the top, we need this one is to 2050, we need 240 million tons of aluminum. That's cumulative demand. It's not every year. And the estimated reserves are 30,000 million. Okay, so we need 241 and there's 30,000 that we know to grab out there. So there's plenty of aluminum for the transition. If we go right to the bottom, that's the only one. Tellurium is the only one where we've got a bit of a shortage, and we'll talk about how shortages or rare things are addressed in the next slides. So rare earths, we talk about rare earths a lot, and there's this narrative that we don't have enough. Well, rare earths are mainly used to do permanent magnets in EV motors. And the narrative is, well, we need these EV motors for EVs, obviously, electric motors, and that will require lots of rare earths, and we don't have enough. Well, lo and behold, ICE vehicles also have lots of electric motors, and starters and alternators in particular are fairly hefty devices that require also permanent magnets, which also require rare earths. So this rare earth problem is not necessarily specific to EVs. It's a bit like the cobalt discussion. The other thing they never talk about is that catalytic converters require platinum, palladium, and rhodium. Those are not rare earths, but they are precious metals, and they're not very abundant, and they're very expensive. So, so that's a problem in terms of supply for catalytic converters. Now, one thing that I hear often is people think that lithium is a rare earth. It is not a rare earth, and it's relatively abundant. It's just that it's not in very concentrated form. I often hear people say that lithium is being mined in a DRC with child labor and all that. So this is usually people who misunderstood some stuff that they were told. and they're talking about lithium with child labor, where they should be talking about cobalt with child labor. And also, I often hear that people are saying that we don't have rare earths like lithium. Well, lithium is not a rare earth. So rare earths are expensive. So two examples are yttrium and neodymium. Those are rare earths. There's about 17, I believe, that are classed as rare earth, but they're all expensive. They're expensive mainly because they're not very rare, but they're not found in high concentration. So the mining and processing requires lots of energy. So that makes the materials quite expensive. So if you look at electric motors, though, there's two types. So there's permanent magnet motors and there's induction motors. So induction motors, it's the electricity that causes the magnetic field, which is needed for the motor, right? So induction does not require rare earths. Some of you may know that some of the Tesla vehicles, the dual motor ones, they will have an induction motor up front and a permanent magnet motor in back, right? So we're already using motors that don't have rare earths. Also, Tesla and other companies, there's a bunch of companies working on this. They actually have developed permanent magnets that do not have rare earths. So in other words, we don't need rare earths for EV motors. Okay, so this rare earths thing is a bit of a red herring, right? So rare earths, like I said, they're expensive, and because they're expensive, industry will find alternatives to try to reduce costs. So if we look at the case of batteries, which is a really good case in point for reducing costs, and there also, we're being told there's not enough materials, and that applies to nickel and cobalt in particular. But nickel and cobalt, they're expensive. They're expensive because they're rare. So because there's not very many of them, they fetch a premium and they're harder to mine and all that. So they're more expensive. Lithium iron phosphate batteries, though, LFP batteries, which many of you are familiar with, they use iron and phosphate, which are very inexpensive and very abundant. And they're inexpensive because they're abundant. And lithium, if you look at an LFP battery, lithium is still an expensive element. There's plenty of lithium. However, mining it and processing it is a difficult process, so it causes lithium to be expensive. So what has industry done? They've developed sodium-ion batteries. So sodium is cheap and abundant. So sodium is all over the place. It's one of the most abundant materials on the planet. And another side benefit of using sodium-ion is that the separators could be made of aluminum. With lithium-ion batteries, they're made of copper, and copper is one of the materials that's not in great supply. But if you're using aluminum, lots of aluminum available, and that problem goes away. So aluminum is cheaper and more abundant, right? So like I said earlier, there's plenty of lithium. I won't talk about numbers here, but if there was not enough lithium, well, we have sodium, and it will always be cheaper. When I say always, it's because the processing is simpler. So it should always be cheaper to produce batteries or to get sodium instead of lithium for batteries. And the processing rate now is better for the environment anyways, so sodium is a good solution. There are cars in China, by the way, that today run with sodium-ion batteries. So again, to recap this not enough materials, we need about 28 to 40 million tons of materials for the transition, and that's cumulative by 2040. And these are recyclable materials, so we could reuse them. We're not throwing them away at end of life. When you look at fossil fuels, we mine 21 billion tons every year, and they're not renewable. Okay, so it's not as if you could recycle them. So let's go to forecasting technology so that we could set the stage for what the numbers that we have forecast. So one of my other sayings that I like is from Wayne Gretzky, is I skate to where the puck is going to be, not to where it has been. So if you look at this in the context of EVs, solar, wind, and batteries, prices are changing or reducing dramatically over time. So, in 5 or 10 years, we're not going to be where we are right now. It's going to be a different world because the economics are gonna change a lot. So, but right now, where are we? We're a fossil fuel based society. About 80% of our energy comes from fossil fuels. And if you want good data on that, the International Energy Agency is a great source of information for historical data. Now, where are we going to be? Where will the puck be? Well, that's really much tougher to predict, and I could talk about that for a while, but I'll try that for now. But the IEA actually is very bad at doing this. So they're great at historical data, but they're very bad at forecasting the future. Now, part of the reason they're bad is because there are vested interests that are pushing the IEA to drive their narrative. So the fossil fuel industry is getting them to make projections that favor fossil fuels. Among others, they're saying that by 2050, we'll still be using 70 million barrels of oil a day. If that's the case, the Earth will be on fire. So it's actually quite impossible for that to occur, for that reason and other reasons. So the IEA, their forecasts are usually linear. We'll see that in the next slide, but they should be S-curves. So technology adoption always happens following an S-curve. And the IEA, they constantly underestimate the pace of change. So if you look at the diagram here, it has a number of different technologies which over the years have been adopted, and it's more or less an S-curve. Now, there's been exceptions between the Great Depression and the end of the Second World War. Things were a bit wonky there. His priorities were on fighting the war and all that. But generally speaking, if you look at all the curves, they're more or less S-shaped. So they start off small when very few people know about the technology. When it's expensive, it's not as mature. As it gets mature, gets less expensive, more people adopt it, then the news travels that this thing is available, and you should hop on the bandwagon and buy a dishwasher or whatever it may be, right? And then so we see a rapid adoption, and then it peters off as we get close to 100% adoption. Now, if you look at the IEA and what they've been saying about EVs, on the left-hand side here, the gray bars are their forecasts. So in 2020, they forecasted what is shown here as EV Outlook 2021. Then the year after, they had another forecast that adjusted based on what the reality of the previous year was. And then again, they had another forecast that was quite a bit higher than the previous forecast. So the red line here is to illustrate that in 2020, they had forecast that we would be at 14%. This is worldwide EV market share. So they had forecasted by 2028 we'd be at 14%, while in fact we reached that by 2022. So in 2020, they forecast it would take 8 years to get to 14%, but the reality is it took 2 years. Okay, I know that if I was doing this kind of predictions in my work when I was working, I would have had to answer to my bosses. So, and this is, you'll see that this is not unique to the forecast for EVs. If you look at something a bit more reasonable, so the blue here is the actuals from the IEA, and the green is from the Rocky Mountain Institute. And you'll see that they're predicting that share will be somewhere by 2030, somewhere between the lower 60s and the high 80s. We actually think this is somewhat conservative, but you can see that it's much more aggressive than the IEA that's saying on the left-hand side that we'll be at 35% in 2030, okay? But the unfortunate, sorry, I didn't mention it here. The unfortunate reality is that lots of governments, including the Canadian government, the U.S. government, lots of European governments, they are setting policy based on the IEA forecasts, which are seen as a gold standard, but they're wildly inaccurate. So that results in policy that's not well adapted. So just briefly here, same thing with solar. This is additions per year, and you see they have flat projections year after year after year. But the reality is that orange curve, which is growing quite fast. Essentially, it's an S curve, right? So, but these are additions every year. So growing much faster than we're saying. Same with wind. They're constantly revising forecasts upwards, and they've always underestimated how much would be deployed. Now, if you look at another source of data, I talked about the barber thing, where if the barber tells you don't need a haircut, it's probably a barber you could trust, okay? And you could trust that it's true that you don't need a haircut. Here we have the equivalent. We have Darren Woods, who's a CEO, or was anyways at the time, of ExxonMobil, who said that every new passenger car sold in the world, not in the US, not in Europe, in the world, will be electric by 2040. Okay, so given that this is arguing against his own business, you could trust that this is something that he firmly believes will actually happen, and we could trust that this will happen too. So, anyways, we are thinking with our estimates that it's going to happen before 2035, not in 2040. So, if you look here briefly on the upper left-hand side, those are the projections that we've done at EVCO. We did the projections starting in 2017. That's why the first two dots are exactly on the red curve there, because the red curve is our projections and the blue is the actuals. And you can see that we've predicted quite well the market share in Canada, actually incredibly well. We're only 0.10% off for 2023. And we're expecting for 2024 that new vehicles will represent 15.5%, or EVs will represent 15.5% of new vehicles in Canada. So, so things aren't slowing down. There's this media narrative that EV sales are slowing down. Every piece of data that I've seen shows that that's not true. There are some instances where, for various market reasons, there may be slower sales one month than the other, but overall, year over year, sales are growing very, very rapidly. So if we look at some of the other numbers, these here are from the Rocky Mountain Institute, and you can see what they're expecting in terms of, again, same as the diagram I showed before, the market share over time. On the left-hand side, what's interesting there is that they have the what they call flows, which is sales, and they have stocks, which is really the fleet, right? So a typical vehicle will last 12 to 15 years. So even if 100% of new vehicles were electric today, there would still be gas cars for some time to come. So, but what they're doing here is they're predicting what that stock will look like, and they're saying that the peak ICE vehicle, or peak number of ICE vehicles on the planet, actually occurred in 2022, 2 years ago. And you can see there that they're predicting that it'll drop significantly over time, and that by 2037 or so, we'll have about half the fleet that will be electric. So if you think about that from a fossil fuel industry point of view, that's a lot less gas sales. So yeah, it's not surprising that they're nervous about this. So, when we talk about where will the puck be, well, this is solar and wind and projections for prices. So we project that they'll keep going down. The same thing is happening with batteries, which means the same thing will happen with EVs. And you see that there's a bit of a bump there, and that was a pandemic bump. So things could come around, and shocks could cause things to change a bit, but the overall tendency is prices are going down, and so these solutions will become more and more economical. So the costs are lower. Like I said, it applies to batteries, it applies to EVs. So in my view, economics alone is going to drive adoption. We're at the point right now where when you look at the total cost of ownership, in most cases, except for the very, very low-end vehicles, the total cost of ownership is already at par with conventional vehicles. So if you look at the overall energy transition, I just wanted to put this slide here to give an understanding of how fast things are happening. So for those of you who were following the Paris Agreement talks in 2015, I know it's a while ago, it's almost 10 years now, China had said that they would peak emissions in 2030, okay? They said they would peak in 2030, but the deployment of wind and solar has been so fast in China, and it continues to accelerate, that the current forecast is they will have peaked emissions in 2023 last year. So China will have peaked emissions 7 years ahead of what they had said they would do, okay? So if you think about that in the context of other countries, India and others that also need to invest lots in renewable energy, the changes are happening very, very fast. So my feeling is we're going to be able to reduce emissions quite rapidly over the next decade or so. So a lot of the content here came from, and the thoughts that I've had come from these 5 books here. The first one, 5 times faster, that refers to the fact that we should be deploying these technologies 5 times faster than we're doing right now to avoid going above 1.5 or 2.0 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Simon Sharp makes a good point of the dynamics, the economics, and all that. But his larger point is we need to go much faster. Now I'll talk about the one on the right-hand side there, Not the End of the World. That's one of my favorite books, actually. Dr. Hannah Ritchie is a lead contributor for Our World in Data. And what she does in that book is she looks at historical data and concludes, rightly so, that in most areas of well-being on the planet, whether it's child deaths or whatever, we are progressing in the right direction. And also, she talks about the possibility of using the technology that we have and developing other technologies to further green industry to get a handle on this climate change problem. So it's not that it's not a bright blue sky. There's a lot of work to do. Lots of potential for problems to occur, but we are on a good path to be able to get to a sustainable future. The other thing, I've got a resource page here. So there's two podcasts that I wanted to highlight in particular. One is Catalyst. They talk about energy matters and all sorts of green energy topics. Very, very interesting. And they have what I see as the most up-to-date information. Another great podcast is a Cleaning Up podcast from Michael Liebreich. Michael Liebreich is the founder of the organization that became Bloomberg New Energy Finance. So he really knows his stuff. He's got one podcast in particular that's entitled Why Net Zero Will Be Easier Than You Think. Okay, the 5 superheroes of the energy transition. So he talks about why things are moving fast and why they will continue moving very fast. And if you're interested in other things that I've said on this topic, previously I've done 2 webinars, one in early January and one in early February, that go over some of these things in more detail. But if you're interested, you're more than welcome to look at those. So that's it for the presentation. So I'm looking forward to getting some questions.
Thanks very much, Raymond. I should have said to the audience earlier on before you began that you are all welcome to submit questions through the Q&A, and Raymond will do his best to answer those. So while you formulate them and submit them, I just one of the other things I didn't hear you say, and it was something that really surprised me about the availability of resources, and that was that. If you look back at for example, the estimated amount of lithium that was available, that the industry said was out there and available 10 years ago, that number has just grown exponentially. And it's because, a lot of these minerals, we weren't really looking for them. So the estimated available reserves of these things were way underestimated, and the more we look, the more we find. And so that's another sort of element to blow away the myths and concerns about availability of minerals.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the sea contains lots of lithium, enough lithium for billions of EVs. So there's lithium. There's plenty of lithium to do what we need to do.
Yeah. All right, well, folks, I hope you have some questions. I'm sorry I didn't remind you earlier on, but I'll call on Jason. I see we have at least a few questions in there. Let's take them on, Jason.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Raymond. So we have a few. Oh, they're coming in now. So I will start with a question from Leslie. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. We currently use coal, gasoline, natural gas, a bunch of different sources for transformation into a usable form, electrical, which is considered efficient. How do you sustain the use of transformed electrical energy?
So yes, fossil fuels provide lots of energy that we use to create electricity and all that. Now, the other big contributor to energy is the sun, right? So the sun is constantly pounding us with huge amounts of energy that we could harvest to do just about anything we want. So if you look at the numbers, I don't remember the exact number. I had it a while back, but we have enough solar energy hitting the Earth to meet all our needs, something like 100 times over. So there's so much available that we need to tap into it to be able to get away from fossil fuels, right? And actually, Edison, for those who might know, Edison was saying that whoever could tap into the sun as a source of energy would become a very rich person.
Great, thank you. Uh, I'll continue with two easy ones. What's the name of your YouTube channel?
Well, the YouTube channel that I talked about there is actually it's related to CACOR, the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, so CACOR. And if you type in CACOR and my last name, you'll find the videos on YouTube.
Raymond, I can, if you send me the links, I will put them in the notes underneath the recording so people can just
Okay.
click on it.
Okay, and related to that as well, can we have Raymond's email address? So if you're comfortable with sharing an email address, and Tim can
Abs
add that to the notes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I put it at the beginning, so I absolutely no worries about sharing it. So raymond.leury@outlook.com is my email address.
And again, I'll add that to the notes.
So
Okay.
do you want the links now, Tim, or do you
No,
want them
no,
after?
just
After?
after
Okay,
the webinar, if you just email them
perfect.
to me, I'll put them in when I upload the video later tonight.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, on the technical side, when do you think that sodium-based batteries will be more commonly available in North America?
That's interesting. There's actually projects right now. There are plants being built to make sodium batteries. It turns out that making sodium batteries is very similar to making lithium-ion LFP batteries in particular. So it's not a huge stretch. It's just a question of getting the plants up and running and getting them producing. Now, sodium ion has a disadvantage that the energy density is lower, right? So what I anticipate is that right now, fixed storage or static storage is using LFP because it's the cheapest and best solution. And LFP also has an energy density issue compared to NMC, right? So, but because if you have static storage, you're not moving those batteries, so the weight doesn't matter so much, right? So what I'm anticipating is that LFP is a solution right now for static storage. I believe that we're going to be transitioning to sodium ion over the next couple of years because it's going to be a cheaper solution. And again, the weight of the battery doesn't matter, right?
And Raymond, just for the folks listening, on August 6th, our webinar, Canada Talks webinar, we're going to have back Jeff Dunn, who can answer all of those technical questions. I'd like to ask him too, things about some of these variations of battery chemistries. They can't all be equally valuable in terms of recycling, right? Some things have a lot of valuable content. Some may be cheap to make the battery, but then maybe there's nothing there that's easy to extract profitably. So some of those questions too, I think August 6th. So folks will certainly let you know about that in advance, but he's confirmed.
Yeah, there's one of the recent Catalyst podcasts that actually talked about that. Because when you look at NMC, if you have nickel and cobalt, those are fairly valuable, so they're really worth recycling. And it's not clear what the business case is for LFP or sodium-ion batteries.
Yeah.
Okay, next one, keeping it a bit local. Raymond, you're in Ottawa. Are you aware of many federal politicians that are actually driving EVs?
That's an interesting question. Actually, I personally know a few of them that are driving EVs. So I don't know if you want names, but there's a few MPs that are driving EVs around Ottawa. So if you look at MPs that are from outside of Ottawa, I think the majority of them wouldn't be driving in Ottawa. They'd be flying in and then staying at a hotel or something. I'm not sure exactly, but yeah, there are several local MPs that are driving EVs.
It's information they should put on their public profiles.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
They don't have to even go on about it, right? Just say,
yeah,
by the way, I drive an EV.
yep.
Do you happen to know if it actually lines up with their decision making?
Well, so I know two of them personally, okay, and I know that um, the environment and doing what we can to reduce greenhouse gases is important to them. There's two in particular that I know quite well and is very important to them. So that's why they bought an EV, right? It wasn't to make a statement or something. It's because they thought it was the choice to make.
Great, thank you. Related to that, when do you predict that Canada will achieve the 100% EV sales target?
That's a very interesting question, $1 million question. So when I showed the projections earlier, we always thought the projections were a bit conservative, actually, although everybody was telling us that we were crazy, but we thought they were a bit conservative. Now, the when we reach 100% will be largely a factor of outside influences. So, for example, if the federal government decides to put a levy like they did in the U.S. on Chinese vehicles, that will have an impact on adoption rates. And depending on which government's in power and their level of wanting to promote EVs, that will change things. But we're thinking that regardless of who is in power, the economics is driving it. And so we're expecting, somewhere around 2030, maybe a bit later, maybe 2032, will be essentially at 100% new vehicles. So if you look at what's happening in Norway, once you get to very large numbers of EVs, what happens is dealers stop wanting to sell gas vehicles and manufacturers stop wanting to supply them. So it sort of helps with the last 5 or 10% of getting to 100. So somewhere around 2030 to 2032 is what we are thinking. I
I
wish I
have,
could. I wish I could bet on that somewhere and make money on it, but
yeah, yeah, and I have to imagine, that it's conceivable that a time will come when the cost of ownership for an ICE vehicle is so high, it stays high. It doesn't ever come down. In fact, probably gets higher over time. And you might have a perfectly usable ICE car in your driveway, but you might not want to have it anymore because getting an electric is so much cheaper to buy a brand new electric with all the new technology that comes in new vehicles and the low cost of ownership and use. To use that gas car in your driveway becomes an obstacle, and that might speed the taper at the other end of that
yeah,
adoption curve.
yeah. It might. I know lots of people, including myself, that originally bought an EV thinking that I'll use it in town and wherever I can, but it rapidly became the principal vehicle we use for all the travel, especially the long distance travel, because it was so much cheaper, right? So I think we'll see the same thing in China. They already have cars that are below $10,000 US, which is at the very low end of the market, and there's no reason that that won't happen here in North America. It will take a bit more time, but because of a bunch of factors, but it will happen where ICE cars, the purchase price will be lower, and the maintenance is lower, and the fueling is lower, right? So why would you want to buy an ICE car,
And
right?
the performance is better.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And related to your predictions, is it safe to say that that is really looking at light passenger vehicles? So heavy transport vehicles, those kinds of specialty things will probably take longer.
Well, actually, so yes, the projection is for light duty vehicles. Now, my feeling is that when you look to fleets, and I've talked to some fleets over the years, cost is a very large driver. And when you look at the main cost for a transport company, there's two big costs. The vehicle doesn't it's not that important a cost, but there's fuel and labor. Okay. And if you could reduce your fuel cost by 2/3 or something, you're going to outcompete everybody else. So my expectation is there's going to be a rush to electrify the fleets. I mean, there's an issue with availability of megawatt level chargers that aren't there yet, and that's causing some issues. But I expect the electrification of those vehicles, especially the ones that drive lots of miles, to happen very rapidly. If you do the math of, let's say it takes an hour to charge a truck instead of 50 minutes or whatever it takes to put diesel in it. If you look at the savings on fuel using electricity, you're talking the equivalent of hundreds of dollars per hour for that driver to be waiting for the truck to charge, right? So I don't think that the charging time is an issue. A lot of people think it's an issue, but the overall thing is, you're running a trucking company. The overall thing you care about is how much in total does it cost me to do the trips that I'm doing, right? And whether whether you're spending a bit more on labor because they have to wait for charging, but a lot less on fuel, well, that's probably an acceptable compromise, right? So I expect electrification to go very fast in the commercial and large vehicle sector.
Makes sense. Thanks. This is a question that popped into my head as well, and apologies if you mentioned it already, but has the role of EV battery recycling and the reintroduction of all of those reusable materials into the manufacturing stream already been mentioned? I don't think you talked about it.
I did not talk about it, but what I could tell you is, excuse me, there's companies like Redwood Materials. What they do is their feedstock is the rejects from the battery manufacturing process, right? So when you make 100 batteries, there might be a certain percentage that don't meet the criteria, so they just send them to recycling, right? And my understanding is that they're already doing that, and they're already providing material that's at least as good, if not higher quality, than the original materials they got from the other suppliers, right? So that's happening. One of the things, by the way, this is going to be an issue, and I believe this is going to become a disinformation thing. We have actually about 4 times the recycling capacity that we need, which means that, and part of the reason for that is there's not enough batteries to recycle because they last longer than we thought and all that, right? But what I expect is going to happen is not all of that capacity is going to survive. So we'll see some companies go bankrupt, and then the news headline will be, "Hey, battery's not profitable. These battery recycling companies are going bankrupt," right? So you can anticipate that happening. But yeah, so there's like I said, about 4 times the capacity that we need at the moment.
Okay. You mentioned extracting minerals from the ocean, and Mark says, isn't ocean bottom mining going to be problematic?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So what I was referring to is actually diluted in the water, in seawater. There's lithium, but yeah, there's some plans to do some mining of there's nuggets that form at the bottom of the ocean in some places that are rich in minerals that are important for the transition. Um, that's a longer question. I don't think I could answer it, but it's not clear, whether that's going to be horrendous or not for the ocean environment. But I would want to be careful and not start mining everywhere all of a sudden and
Yeah,
cause significant issues, right?
yeah, the oceans are under enough pressure as it is.
Yeah.
But you were referring, just to be crystal clear, you were referring to the fact that you can take seawater and extract from the seawater lithium.
Yes. Yes.
That's what you were referring to. Yeah.
Yes.
If
Yeah.
we needed to go that route, it's a
Yes.
huge resource of lithium that we could
Exactly.
tap into.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that ties back to the earlier discussion about battery material recycling, because unlike fossil fuel use, where it's one use and gone, eventually we get to a largely circular economy where we are just reprocessing old batteries to make new batteries. and not
Yep.
digging as much stuff out of the ground.
Yeah, and the same with the permanent magnets, the same with the copper, the aluminum, all the other metals that we need to, build, whether it be EVs or windmills or solar installations. Those are largely things that could be recycled quite easily.
Yeah,
Uh,
Chris jumps in there. Chris Guernsey jumps in with a comment that you can also get sodium from seawater. It's
Yes,
salty.
yeah, there's sodium everywhere. That's sourcing that is not a problem.
Yeah.
Okay. Another Mark asks, why doesn't our media take more responsibility to do more to call out disinformation as it's being disseminated?
Well, my understanding of that is that there's a lot of think tanks. So if you probably heard of some of them, like the Fraser Institute, the Cato Institute. There's a whole bunch of them, and what they're doing is they're running programs to influence people. They're doing op-eds or letters to the editor, talking to journalists, and bringing journalists to their conferences and trying to expose their point of view. So if you're a journalist that doesn't know the subject area, you're being fed all sorts of stuff that seems to make sense, right? But unfortunately, there's a lot of money on the bad side of things, if I could put that, so the fossil fuel industry, where they're having impact on the climate, and there's very little money on the other side to combat that, right? So it's a bit of a mismatch at this point. My hope is that profits of fossil fuel companies diminish so much that they won't have money to run campaigns like that, and that some of the disinformation will disappear.
Okay.
Jason, I think we've got time for one more
One,
question.
one more. Okay. Everyone's favorite topic. How long do you think the myth of hydrogen for energy will endure and distract from our EV and grid transition?
Wow, that's a good question. I've talked a lot about hydrogen in the past, and actually, if you want to know more about that, Michael Liebreich in the Cleanup podcast talks about hydrogen quite a bit. He's the one who did the hydrogen ladder. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's a hydrogen ladder where he explains where hydrogen has a future and where it doesn't. And from his perspective, for any transport and energy application, it's pretty well out of the picture, right? Um, so how long is it going to last? Well, you have to think about who's pushing the narrative, right? So who has an interest for hydrogen to be a thing? Well, again, it's the fossil fuel industry, because they're looking at instead of heating homes with natural gas, they want to use the natural gas to produce hydrogen. So they're looking for markets and continuing markets for products that they want to be selling, right? And they're pushing very hard. So they're lobbying very, very hard everywhere, and they're getting the ear of politicians and other decision makers. And unfortunately, it's to me, it's a huge distraction. Not that we don't need any hydrogen at all. We need hydrogen where it has to do with the chemistry, that you need a specific element. So here I'm talking about things like green steel, where we could use hydrogen to process ore into steel, that kind of thing, right? But for anything that's energy and transport, I don't see a future.
All right.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks, Jason, for doing that. Chris in the background there, and James McCallum too, who helps out with numbers on the webinar and kind of works behind the scenes for the most part. But Raymond, terrific talk. I mean, I hope everybody here enjoyed it. I certainly did. It's you do a good job of pulling together factoids that we hear in our EV life, but you bring them all together into one discussion, and I think that makes it helpful for everybody to digest. So I thank you for that.
Well, thank you for having me. This was an honor and a pleasure.
Great stuff. So I'll just say a few words about next month on Canada Talks Electric Cars. We're going to address fairly frequently asked question about electric vehicles' impact on our auto insurance, both the rates and the type of coverage that we need for EVs. Not all Canadian provinces require private auto insurance, so we'll also talk about home insurance and any potential impact stemming from EV ownership and EV charging in your garage and in your driveway. Our guest speaker will be a gentleman by the name of Adam Doulaban. It's a third generation principal broker and owner of Doulaban Insurance Brokers, which is a leading national independent insurance brokerage. We'll also be rolling out some exciting new EV Society member insurance related benefits. So we've got some pretty exciting news coming up for our EV Society members. If you aren't a member and you've stuck in it, held on this long tonight, please think about registering and becoming a member. We appreciate the membership and your membership fee of only $50 a year. So once again, remember next month's webinar. It will be held on Tuesday, July 2nd at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And on behalf of all of us here at EV Society, thanks a lot for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. This concludes tonight's webinar.